There's a problem about this. Elections in the United States, especially in the last 30, 40 years, are essentially run by the public relations industry. They sell candidates, they market candidates pretty much the way they market toothpaste, and they're not secret about it. So, for example, you may know, Obama's campaign last year won the award from the main journal of the advertising industry for the best marketing campaign of the year. He beat out Apple computers. And in the business press, executives were just exultant, euphoric. They were saying, this is the best we've ever done since we started marketing candidates, best results since Reagan. It's going to change the atmosphere in corporate boardrooms. You know, we have figured out better ways to do things. Well, you want to market your there's another similarity between marketing toothpaste and marketing candidates. Marketing toothpaste is done in a way to undermine markets. You especially like markets if you study an economics course, but not if you're in the business world. They want to undermine markets. Markets are based on informed consumers making rational choices. Everyone who took a course in economics knows that. But anyone who's looked at a television ad knows that business is putting huge resources into trying to create uninformed consumers making irrational choices. If you had a market system, General Motors would put up a little notice saying, here's what we have for sale next year or something. That's not what they do. You know, they have a football player, a sexy actress, you know, car climbing up to heaven. The point is to try to create an uninformed consumer who will make irrational choices. And you have to do the same when you're marketing candidates. You have to create uninformed electorate making irrational choices. And that's what they're dedicated to, and they tell you, you know, and we can see it. That's why issues are kept out of campaigns. The party managers read polls. I mean, they know about the Democratic deficit. They know how sharp it is. So the obvious conclusion is just keep campaigns to, you know, personalities, rhetoric, flourishes, gossip, whatever, but make sure not to talk about issues, because that's dangerous. Then you get these ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, the public, entering into the political arena, and we don't want that for reasons that go way back, you know, way back to Madison, in fact. Take a different form, and more sophisticated form in the 20th century. So you look at Obama's campaign, what was it about? What were there were slogans. The slogans were hope and change. Why? Because party managers read polls, and they can see that 80% of the public thought the country's going in the wrong direction. Okay, therefore, when we market a candidate, it's hope and change, meaning no hope and no change, but not surprising. Actually, McCain's campaign had the same slogans. He just didn't carry it off as well, and was less favored by the major institutions. Well, they've also told us what their next step is going to be. So the campaign of the health insurers, and the banks, which won such great rewards, are now going to be followed by the energy corporations. The American Petroleum Institute announced a couple of weeks ago that they're going to use the model of the so-called health reform campaigns, you know, to try to ensure that Congress doesn't pass even the kind of limited energy and environmental bills that are conceivably possible. And they've been joined by the Chamber of Commerce, you know, the major business lobby and other business lobbies. They smell success, they're going to follow the model. Now, actually, in the Chamber of Commerce, the big business lobby, there's a split. A couple of the major corporations pulled out, the ones that are developing nuclear energy, because they have a different way of harming the public. They don't produce greenhouse gases, so therefore they're perfectly happy if Congress puts a cap and trade or something. Meanwhile, they'll destroy us in a different fashion. But so there is a split in the business community about this, and when there's a split in the business community, you do get policy choices. You know, things happen in the political arena, and that's what we're seeing right now. Well, of course, they all know that the outcome, not very long-term, is that their grandchildren won't have a chance for decent survival. But again, that's just not relevant, as in the other cases I mentioned. And again, it's not because they're bad people or anything. That is the structure of the institutions that we live in. You don't take part in that framework of thinking, you're not part of it, you're out. You know, affects even legal requirements. So it's the institutions that have to change. Well, the observation that elites don't fail, very rarely fail, is very broad. Let me just take one example from a little farther back, because I think it's highly pertinent today, and it's something we know a lot about, the Vietnam War. There's a doctrinal picture of this, which says the Vietnam War was a failure, okay? And actually the left has contributed to this. The anti-war movement wanted to win something, so they said, okay, it was a failure. It wasn't a failure. It was a success, pretty good success. The U.S. didn't achieve its major aim, its ultimate aims, you know. So like it didn't turn Vietnam into the Philippines, but it achieved its major aims. And the major aims are quite significant. They're a leading theme of modern history right up till today. There was a concern about Vietnam. We know a lot about it. There's an internal record. There was a concern, a deep concern in the 1950s. The concern was that Vietnam could be what Henry Kissinger later called a virus that would spread contagion, his terms when he was preparing the overthrow of the Allende government, the parliamentary government in Chile. It's a virus that might spread contagion. It might lead to successful independent development out of the framework of American power. And that's a virus in the sense that this will spread contagion because others with similar problems might pick it up. Well, in the case of Vietnam, the concerns were very real. I mean, Eisenhower talked about the resources of Vietnam and so on, but that was a cover. They didn't really care about Vietnam. But what they did care about was Asia. And they recognized that if Vietnam did move on a path of successful independent development, the virus could spread to Thailand. It might spread to Indonesia, which does have rich resources. It might even spread to Japan, what Asia historian John Dower called the super domino. The dominoes would fall, but not in the way they frighten people with. They'd fall because they'd follow, the contagion would spread. If it spread to Japan, Japan could accommodate to an independent Asian system and become its technological and industrial center. In other words, Japan would construct the new order that it had tried to construct during the Second World War. The Pacific phase of the Second World War was fought to prevent that. In the 1950s, U.S. planners were not ready to lose the Second World War. So it was big issues at stake. Well, when you have a virus that might spread contagion, what you do is kill a virus and inoculate the potential victims of the contagion. And that's what happened. Vietnam was destroyed. The surrounding region was, in the surrounding region, vicious dictatorships were imposed, country after country, to make sure the contagion didn't spread. And by the late 60s, things were pretty much in order. By about, say, 1970 or so, and the business press already recognized that the U.S. had achieved its major objectives and didn't see any point wasting any more money on it, and pressured Johnson to start to pull out. Well, it's a victory in some reason. It's not a total victory, so it's called a failure. Like they didn't totally incorporate Vietnam into the U.S. system. But it's a major success, and planners understood it. McGeorge Bundy, who was National Security Advisor for Johnson and Kennedy, later recognized and said that if they'd been smart, they would have stopped the Vietnam War in 1965 when the General Suharto took over Indonesia, killed maybe 1 million people or so, destroyed the one mass-based political party, opened the country up to foreign investors, There was complete euphoria about this when it happened. They couldn't contain themselves. Like James Reston in the New York Times, a gleam of light in Asia. You know, everybody was just euphoric. They knew what was happening. It was called a staggering mass slaughter and so on, but the greatest thing since ice cream, same in England and Australia and everywhere. And that ended the danger. The rot was not going to spread. You know, contagion wasn't going to spread. That's when they should have stopped destroying Vietnam and wasting our money and energy. Bundy's conception in retrospect, which is accurate. Now, the reason why this is pertinent today is that this is the leading theme of international affairs, really. If there's a threat of what's called radical nationalism, independent development, even in the smallest place, like a fishing cooperative in Grenada or something, it's dangerous. It could spread. Others could get the idea and they could go on. It's kind of like taking over a factory. If you do it, yeah, the rot can spread. You want to make sure you stamp it out right away. And if you look over the history of what's called the Cold War, that's what it is. And it doesn't change with the end of the Cold War. You want to understand the Cold War, the best place, and its aftermath, the best place to look is what happened when the Berlin Wall fell. Okay, no more Soviet Union. Theoretically, the Cold War was to defend it. You know, the U.S. plan, the reason U.S. intervened all over the world was to defend ourselves from the Russians. Okay, what happened after the Soviet Union disappeared? Well, the Bush administration, this is Bush number 1, immediately came out with a national security strategy and a budget which said, in effect, nothing's going to change, just new pretexts. So we still need a huge military force, not to defend ourselves from the Russians, but literally because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. We have to maintain what's called the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism for high-tech industry, you know, funded basically by the taxpayer. We have to maintain that. We have to maintain intervention forces pointed at the Middle East, which is the crucial region where the world's energy resources are. And then it adds intervention forces direct to the Middle East where the threats to our interests, significant threats to our interests, could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. So, sorry folks, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but now that the Kremlin's gone, we got to tell you the truth. Clouds are lifting. Keep the intervention forces aimed at the threat of independent nationalism. That's why the Obama administration, following Bush, is building up military forces in the training of officers and building military forces in Latin America to try to stem the danger. And their mission is to combat what's called radical populism, the threat of independence. A lot of different ways to approach this, but the policies remain remarkably stable because they're sensible. So thinking about what happened in the Vietnam War is highly pertinent today, as it's been for years. And there's another factor. There was a domestic effect of the not just the Vietnam War, but the Vietnam War and other things. The country was falling out of control. The most important part of the famous Pentagon Papers, and therefore the one that's never mentioned anywhere, is its last section. Pentagon Papers end in mid-1968. Those who remember will recall in January 1968, Tet Offensive came along, convinced the U.S. business community it's going to be a long, slow war, might as well pull out. Big power play. They sort of forced Johnson to resign and so on. But Johnson wanted to send a couple 100,000 more troops, and the Joint Chiefs objected. They didn't want to do it. And they said, we're going to need the troops for civil disorder control in the United States. There's just too much agitation among young people, among women, among minorities. The country's going to fall out of control. So we need those troops here. Well, yeah, that's one of the successes of the anti-war movement. It frightened power enough so that they didn't want to go on because they're going to lose the country. And something had to be done. There were two big problems that were faced. One is that during the 60s, there began to develop a principled critique of aggression and violence. Now that's dangerous. It's okay to have criticism, say, of the Obama kind. Like Obama is regarded as a critic of the Iraq War because he said it was a strategic blunder. That's okay. That's like Nazi generals after Stalingrad. It's a strategic blunder. You shouldn't have fought a two-front war. Or, you know, you could read it in Pravda in the 1980s. It was stupid to send troops to Afghanistan. So that kind of criticism is fine. But principled critique, you know, it's not that it's a blunder. It's not that it's costing us too much. It's just criminal. That's very dangerous. And that was rampant. You didn't read it in the press. There's nothing like that in the press or intellectual journals and so on. But the polls showed it. So by the end of the war, mid-70s, about 70% of the population said the war is not a mistake. It's fundamentally wrong and immoral. That's serious. You got to do something about that. So there's principled critique of the use of violence, very bad news, and the country was just becoming too free. It was what was called a crisis of democracy among liberal intellectuals. Too much democracy. People who are usually marginalized, passive, apathetic, what are called the special interests, like minorities, women, farmers, labor, young, old, the special interests. They were just entering, they're pressing their own demands. Literally called a crisis of democracy by the liberals, incidentally. So you got to get the country under control again, and you have to overcome this danger that the war itself will be seen as a criminal exercise of violence, and they hit upon a device. It's called the war on drugs. The war on drugs goes way back, but it was picked up by Nixon very explicitly with the goal of overcoming these two problems. So a myth was concocted about the addicted army. The army's fallen apart because the communists are giving them drugs. Then you get people like Walter Cronkite, highly respected liberal commentator, saying our troops in Vietnam the communists are fighting our troops not only with guns but with drugs. That's the real tragedy of the war, James Reston and others. We're the victims of the war. Look what they're doing to us. And that's a kind of poison pill. These addicted troops are going to come home and spread havoc in the civilian society. These communists are really nasty creatures. So we're the victims, not the aggressors. And furthermore, we have to have law and order programs at home. Well, you know what that means. Pretty soon you get the huge incarceration rate and so on. So it's a technique for dealing with both of the huge problems that came after the Vietnam War. Pretty soon you have President Carter, when he was president, saying that he was asked at a news conference, don't we owe the Vietnamese some debt because of what we did to them? He said, we owe them no debt because the destruction was mutual. Okay, that's at the liberal extreme. When you get to, say, George Bush #1, his line was, of course, we'll never forgive the Vietnamese for what they did to us, but we're magnanimous and we'll allow them to enter the world if they deal honestly with the one moral problem left over from the war, if they devote themselves to finding the remains of American pilots who were shot down, like when they were flying over Iowa or something. That's the one moral problem, but if they deal with that, well, maybe we'll never forgive them, but we'll put it aside. It's a pretty remarkable achievement. Also the fact that nobody commented on any of it. It's kind of like accepted as normal. Well, this is very much alive today. The partial failure was partially overcome. Now, regularly, wars tend to incite thinking. People start to think about things. And every war is followed by a major repression. It's kind of clockwork. So after the First World War came Wilson's Red Scare, probably the worst period of repression in American history. After the Second World War came what's called McCarthyism, mislabeled, actually started by the Democrats, to try to beat back the wave of radicalism that developed during the Depression and the war. And after the Vietnam War came this. Well, it was only partially, that's not only this, there are many other mechanisms. Like students it was understood that students are too free, and something has to be done about that. And things are done, like, for example, raising tuitions. If you can catch students in a debt trap, like if they get out of school with a huge debt, well, they're trapped, and many other means. The neoliberal financial economic order that was instituted also partly has this effect, and presumably understood and planned for it. Well, but this time, after the Vietnam War, interestingly, the repression was only partially successful, nowhere near as much as the Red Scare or the post-Second World War repression. In fact, activism continued and still continues. The feminist movement, for example, which probably changed American society more than any of the other outcomes of the activism of the 60s, that was a 1970s movement mainly. Same with the environmental movement, 1970s. The anti-nuclear movement, which reached 80% of the population, was the 80s. The solidarity movements, which are something totally new in the history of imperialism, that was the 80s. The global justice movement, last decade or so, and it keeps growing and expanding. And the effort to beat it back also keeps growing and expanding. In fact, the state power was very much constrained by this. Reagan could not resort to Vietnam-style tactics in his wars in Central America in the 80s. Had to use mercenaries. The Iraq War is the same. I mean, the United States has not been able to carry out, say, saturation bombing of the Iraqi countryside. They got bad enough what happened, but much more constrained than Kennedy and Johnson in the 60s, because there's just more opposition. Opposition to the Vietnam War took years before it developed. In the case of the Iraq War, the first time in history that there was massive protest before the war officially started, and that registers. So it's up and back, but there's moves forward, and there's plenty that can be done. Right here, for example, the coffee house movement, which developed during the 60s, the GI Coffee House, that's right nearby, Fort Lewis. And it's part of a much wider movement. It's represented here, groups from all over the place. You didn't have that in the 1960s or the 70s. So there's a lot, there's a lot you can work from a higher plane than in the past, thanks to earlier achievements. For the world, not the rich countries of the West, the food crisis is much more serious than the financial crisis. And you read it in third world journals. I mean, the UN recently just announced that the number of people facing starvation passed 1 billion. And they simultaneously announced that the World Food Program is cutting back its funding by about 25% because the rich countries are refusing to meet their obligations. Well, that's a large-scale massacre. I mean, Africa alone, Southern Africa alone, just looking at children alone in Southern Africa, the death rate from easily preventable disease and malnutrition is at the level of Rwanda. And not for 100 days, but every day, and getting worse. That's a huge crisis. And there's also another possible crisis of survival. That's nuclear weapons. That's no joke. Also right on the front pages. Now, the focus now is on Iran. And it's interesting to look at it. Iran is portrayed as a serious threat to the world. Why? Well, Iran is defying the international community on enrichment. It's concealing what it's doing, terrible threat. What does it mean to say that Iran is defying the international community? It's an interesting concept. Who's the international community? I mean, the global south, which is most of the countries in the world, and most of the population, they strongly support Iran's right to enrich uranium as a signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Some of them pretty strongly, including U.S. favorites like Lula in Brazil, just came out with a very strong endorsement of that. It's not published because it's not the right thing. If Chavez had said it, it'd be a headline. What about the American population? Well, they're not part of the international community either. The majority of the American population support that right. So the international community turns out to be Washington and whoever happens to be going along with it. And it's true that Iran is defying them. What about the American population, incidentally, a large majority, have a very sensible view of how this problem ought to be resolved, but it's not on the agenda. A large majority of the population are in favor of a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. That would mean, that would include Iran, Israel, any American forces deployed there. Well, that's a very constructive way to mitigate and probably terminate whatever crisis there is. But that's not even on the agenda. Now, there are nuclear weapons-free zones being developed around the world, and those are important, and there's an important feature of them. The U.S., point by point, is undermining them. Just last week, the African Union did finally get around to full ratification of a nuclear weapons-free zone in Africa, with one exception, Diego Garcia. It's a British-owned island, which is, Africans say, rightly, is part of Mauritius, part of Africa, but the U.S. uses it as a major military base. The population was kicked out, and a huge military base there being used for U.S. wars in the Middle East and Central Asia. So therefore the U.S. and Britain, loyal lackey, refused to go along with the nuclear weapons-free zone. That's the one holdout. Same is happening in the South Pacific. There's a South Pacific nuclear weapons-free zone, but the U.S. insists on excluding the U.S. possessions there, Marshall Islands and so on, because they're used for nuclear weapons testing and development. France did so for a while too. That's where they were carrying out their nuclear tests. And the Middle East, which is the most important case, it's just not discussable. And it's worth bearing in mind that the United States and Britain have a special responsibility in this regard. Those two countries are committed to a nuclear weapons-free zone for a very simple reason. It's a UN Security Council Resolution 687, 1991, which is what Britain and the United States appealed to when they were seeking some kind of thin legal cover for the invasion of Iraq. Well, what does that resolution say? One provision in it is that the countries that sign it are committed to establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Okay, that's a large majority of the population's in favor of it. The U.S. and Britain are formally committed to it. It's the only thing that makes any sense. Most of the world's in favor of it. It's not on the agenda. I mean, that's a democratic deficit with a vengeance and lies behind the dangers that are happening right now. Well, you know, I'm sure Obama made a big UN speech on non-proliferation a couple of weeks ago. The Security Council came out with a strong resolution which is described as a victory for Obama and his effort to contain Iran. He called on everyone to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty, much eloquent rhetoric. Take a look at the resolution that was passed. It says nothing about Iran. It's directed against the United States, Israel, India, and Pakistan. Israel, India, and Pakistan are the three countries that have never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They have nuclear weapons with the support of the United States. Pakistan's nuclear weapons are one of Reagan's gifts to the world. He was supporting his favorite radical Islamist dictator, Zia-ul-Haq, who Islamized Pakistan with consequences that we now have. And in order to keep pouring money in there, they pretended they didn't know they were developing nuclear weapons. Israel, I don't have to mention. In the case of India, just a year ago, the U.S. signed a treaty with India and then kind of railroaded the world and the big powers into accepting it, which grants India exemption from the conditions on non-signers of the Non-Proliferation Treaty who are developing nuclear weapons. They're developing them. And now the United States is able to provide them with aid to develop them. We call it civilian aid, but of course it immediately transfers over into military aid. You can read that in any of the military journals. So all three of them, with their superpower patron, are the targets of the Security Council resolution, which says that the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is the cornerstone of nuclear weapons concerns, and everyone must sign it and abide by it. Iran is a signer. Another provision of this treaty, of this resolution, calls for the use of peaceful means in the case of disputes over nuclear weapons. Well, who's that directed at? At the United States and Israel, which are threatening force. Only ones who are threatening force. Threatening force happens to be a violation of the UN Charter, but it's also a violation of this resolution that was just passed. There's no other country against which the resolution is directed. That's one of the reasons the text isn't published, I suppose, but you can find it easily enough. Well, 3 days after the Security Council resolution was passed, India announced, quoting, that it can now build nuclear weapons with the same destructive power as those in the arsenals of the world's major nuclear powers. Okay, that's serious, not only in itself, but because it stimulates Pakistan to try to do something to respond to it. They've already come very close to nuclear war twice, could happen again. It's also a threat to China. Iran is accused of concealing something. India is not concealing anything. They're announcing it loudly, right on the front pages outside the United States. I didn't see it reported here. They're saying, yeah, we have increased our nuclear weapons capacity thanks to your aid, and now we're at the level of the superpowers in kilotons, 200 kilotons. Well, that's open. Meanwhile, we debate whether Iran is concealing something. Iran is charged with with not being open and frank with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is true, they're not. But last week, the international agency passed a resolution calling on Israel to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty and to open up its nuclear facilities to inspection. Well, the United States and Europe tried to block the resolution, but when they couldn't block it, they voted against it, but it passed anyway. But it doesn't matter. I don't think it's been reported here even. But that's much more serious than anything Iran is doing. Okay, that's what's actually going on in the world. And if we want, we can let it happen. And it's not a joke. I mean, these are things that really do increase the quite serious threat of a nuclear catastrophe, which is beyond thinkable. Well, there isn't any reason to sit by passively and let all these things happen and watch elites succeed in and while everyone else fails massively, and with major catastrophes looming in many dimensions. Okay, end of 5-minute lecture.